Pleasure to be here to see all these 3D people. Everybody's beautiful today. I'm going to try to answer the question here. That we're at a sensor conference, and I'm sure you're asking yourselves, does it work? Do we make an effect? And that's what this topic is now. I'll be trying to answer how safe is the Waymo Driver. So Waymo 1 is a service. It's a shared electric autonomous mobility service that's currently running in 3 cities: Los Angeles, Phoenix, Arizona, and San Francisco. And I'm a scientist. I am director of safety research and best practices. I have a long background of publishing papers. I have a Google Scholar account. I have this citation index. I've been adjunct professor at 2 universities, all this stuff, my entire career. I started out with driver monitoring systems. So I want to talk today about this work and evidence, and how evidence and science makes a difference in what we're actually doing. And within safety is a multifaceted topic. It's something that we have an ecosystem of methodologies. That's, I think, the best way of thinking of it. But within that ecosystem, people tend to think of one main metric. The favorite metric is, what is the crash rate? How does the crash rate relate to human performance? And that's what I'll talk about today. But there are, like I said, multifaceted. There's 2 main perspectives in safety. One is an emotional safety, emotional-based, an experience-based safety. When you are in the vehicle, do you feel fear? Do you feel safe? There's a security aspect to that. It's a user experience. And some people talk about safety as an experience and an emotion. But traditionally, we've all worked with national statistics. Vision Zero on fatalities and seriously injured requires a different way of working. There's a national road safety strategy in the United States now focused on fatalities and seriously injured. And I think that one of the main insights is you need to work differently with the right part of this diagram. You need to understand that it is defined by human tolerance limits. So kinetic energy passes the body's requirements on kinetic energy. And this is actually really important because we're actually in a phase where we need to maintain our focus on what actually safety is. So I'll get into this. So we've seen this bubble up now, and we understand there are some concerns, particularly in San Francisco, and we want to be good neighbors, and I'll be showing our transparency and how we would like to advance science. So one way to think of it is that we are a company with a very unique strategy where we're trying to differentiate ourselves by publishing papers, by publishing data. We've published 20 papers since I started in 2020. They're all available on our website now. And what we're doing is trying to use the scientific method. Scientific method is publishing data, and then we give our interpretation of that, and you look at the data, and you form your own interpretation of the data. So it is actually really key to read the papers. Please do that. And I think that, so what happens is we provide data and observations, our interpretation, then there's rigorous skepticism. That's the next phase. And these interpretations can be biased by either a predetermined pessimistic opinion or a predetermined optimistic opinion. But ideally, the discussion goes through a phase of rigorous debate based on evidence. not on opinions. So that's what we're trying to achieve by publishing these. These assumptions, they can distort interpretations. So we believe that the data speaks for itself, and even though some of the debates are not driven by evidence, and even if something is wrong, if there's incorrect calculations, that should be corrected. And we've seen, unfortunately, some instances of incorrect, inflated or deflated collisions, conclusions about safety. For example, in San Francisco, SFMTA and CTA, we've asked for retraction and correction of their letter towards CPUC, where there was some incorrect conclusions made. But moving on, I will summarize the key results that we've been able to amass, and I think I'm really happy that we're amassing or a growing, robust evidence, a body of evidence that shows that we have an exceptional safety record. So it doesn't feel like very long ago in the spring when we published our first 1,000,000 miles on rider only when there's nobody in the vehicle. And in that data, it was a total collisions. We looked at all contact events, not just collisions that are reported for requirements for NHTSA or DMV. We looked at all contact events, even those without injury or without property damage. And we had no reported injuries, no collisions with pedestrians, and all of the vehicle-to-vehicle collisions we saw involved some degree of dangerous human driving. So recently, just a few weeks ago, we released another study that we did together with Swiss Re. Swiss Re is one of the world's largest insurance firms, reinsurance firms, and their business model is to calculate risk. So there's this whole process of standardizing how to do analyses that's been developed through 70 years or over 70 years in the insurance industry. Actuaries look at data. This is important for their business model. So this is what they did. They looked at our 3.8 million miles with no human in the driver's seat, and we found together with them that there's the bodily injury claim frequency was reduced 100%, and property damage was reduced 76%. This is major news. This is massive effects here. And then in addition to that, we've been doing other research previously where we've reconstructed all of the fatalities in Chandler over 10 years. This is an area which is part of our ODD, and we were able to show that we avoid all these fatalities, either avoid or mitigate all of the fatalities with some form of collision avoidance, except in those cases where you're hit from behind. So this is one way of working with fatalities that we are using as part of our evidence. And then we also are doing the more traditional thing, which is scenario-based testing. We call that collision avoidance testing. And in collision avoidance testing, we compare ourselves with a nominal or non-impaired attentive human. The NEON model is what we call it. If you run the non-attentive, unimpaired human through the same scenarios, what does that performance look like? And we beat that, so that's our standard that we use when we do collision avoidance testing. We've also shared all of our holistic readiness methodologies in 2020. There's many methodologies that we use. We've also shared just this year the safety case approach. Our safety case is what determines risk, and our approach is quite detailed, and I encourage you to use that as a toolkit for guidance. But we also released what human speeding looks like in the cities we're operating in Phoenix and San Francisco. And I thought that this was an amazing result because in the National Road Safety Strategy and other Vision Zero, one of the pillars of that is to reduce speed. And this is what we're able to see is that there's 27 to 47% of what what other drivers are doing in the environments we're driving, where speed is 27 to 47% over speeding. So that is eliminated with an autonomous vehicle. And I think it's really interesting to think of the effects when you start having more autonomous vehicles. I mean, there's been some research showing that 10% would create a traffic calming effect just with 10% of Waymos. So within safety impact, we see that we have, to understand where it comes in, this is our safety case, and this is how we see safety impact coming in is a continuous refinement and evidence or continuous confidence growth. So we'll continue to do this research. We had 1 million miles, we had 3.8 million miles. We'll continue to do this and build up our confidence as we go forward, looking at safety from a number of different angles. So there's two primary ways that you can approach this. And one is what I've showed that we've worked in this partnership with Swiss Re, and we chose that consciously because it has consistent reporting standards. This is really, really important for my talk today. There's a higher reporting frequency, which means that there's more crashes that are reported to insurance companies than in national crash databases. And it also includes injuries that are also non-collision injuries. But there's some other bonuses with insurance data, and that's what one of the bonuses is. It looks at responsibility. If you're looking at who is contributing to a crash, who's responsible for a crash, we included all the cases where we were responsible or partially responsible. So that effect is really, I think, what you think of with safety, is causing crashes. But that effect does get diluted when you look at the overall crash count. An overall crash count includes when others are making mistakes and run into you. And in many of these cases, like standing still and getting hit from behind at an intersection is an example of that, where there's very little you can do, if anything. The other way, which most people think of, is to use crash comparison, overall crash rates. And that's, I think, where most people go and think, what is the crash rate, overall crash rate? But with that, I need to show you that this is an approach that's possible, but you need to adjust for all the underreported events. So the gray part here in this, you see that there's a lot of missing data in the reported crashes to governments. What we were able to do in the insurance data, and this is I think, exceptionally interesting data, is that we're actually significant. And let me just see if this fancy tool works here. Yes, there. You can see the rider-only data that were in bodily injury significantly lower than the blue, which is the human performance. And then also on property damage, we're significantly lower. But in addition to that, you can see that we have testing operations. Let me see if this works. The TO, testing operations, that's 35 million miles. And that exposure is exposure to AV unique crashes or AV unique failures. That's integrated. We've had that as part. So if you combine those two, 3.8 plus 35 million miles, you see a lot of miles that we've been exposed to cases where there could be something going wrong as an initiator. But the science behind safety impact is what I want to talk mostly about today. It's a simple thing. There's 4 numbers. You just do crashes and the amount of miles on the human side against the autonomous side. It's very simple. Anybody can do it. But there's a lot of tricks that are going on right now, and I want to talk about those tricks. These things that are potentially people aren't aware of the mistakes that are being made, and I want to rule out that it's from lack of knowledge that people are making mistakes. So it could be that there's an intentional piece to it, but I want to make sure that anyone is not suffering from lack of knowledge. So there's these challenges and misconceptions when calculating crash rates, and I think you being engineers, this will be a fascinating topic for you, hopefully. So there's 4 separate ones I'll talk about. One, and I think you've maybe picked up on it so far, that there's a difference in reporting thresholds. When you compare an apple, you need another apple. You don't do apples and oranges. And this has to do with the definition of crashes. What is a crash? What do you count as a crash? So right now, in your mind, you're thinking an injury or a property damage, something that gets reported, something when you tell somebody, I've been in a crash, they say, oh my God, because it's a crash. They don't say that, oh, it's a scratch or a dent on your car. Imagine if you went to a rental car company and you forgot to inspect the car, you come back, and then someone claims that you have 20 crashes when you went to visit grandma. I don't think that's what you would agree with. So what's going on right now is we have strict reporting conventions or requirements on us where we have a standing general order with any physical impact with property damage, any property damage. And that's also from the DMV, any collision with damage. So what we reported when we did our 1 million miles is we reported all 20, we called them contact events. And then off to the right, you see contact events. What are those? So we had 9 contacts where there was no property damage for us or anybody else. 9 of them. We had 9 contacts where there were scratches or dents. And this is what we're talking now about, scratches or dents, or it's not fender benders. So the term fender bender, which was used previously as a minor crash, that's not what we're talking about now. We're talking about scratches and dents. So we had 2, what we call SIS reportable. It's a crash database, it requires police reports and towaways. So we had 2 of those, and both were involved with rear-end cases. So one of the things is we have a very high likelihood, high recall of detecting events because we have the sensors on the vehicles. And if you think of that yourself, how would you find a comparison condition with humans? How would you find that? And so this has been studied. This is a NHTSA report where they're looking at the underreporting. And what they were finding for 2023 is that there's 60% of property damage only collisions that don't get reported to police. So 60%. And then the rest there, you see this is the MAS scale where you have increasing injury, and there's a proportion that averages out to 32% of injury collisions that are not reported to police. So obviously this matters. And then on top of that, you have to start thinking, well, how about all these scratches and dents and minor collisions and that kind of thing? How many of those have been missing? So, or even events, contact events where there was no damage or no injuries. How do you find those events? So we're going to take a little estimation, or this is illustrating the problem here with the data we've seen that's available. The blue and the green comes from crash databases. So this has to do with the requirement of towaway crashes and police reports. And then this is the gray is a hypothetical. When you introduce the requirement to compare with any property damage, then you need to find something that's comparable. So it's either you create that, You create that by doing an estimate. And here's some examples. It's really hard to look, what is the property damage above $1,000, which is the reporting requirement for California and Arizona? What is the property damage frequency below $1,000? How many cases of $100 property damage are there out there? Someone has to try to answer that question. And how many cases where there's no property damage or injuries out there? And then you get into these minor cases, and it's either you correct it by creating an estimate, or you have another approach. And another approach would be, for example, to have a reporting threshold, like the EDRs. They have a triggering threshold for acceleration. That's one other way that could be possible. The third example is a mathematical trap. And you're engineers, so you'll love this. So what people do is they take the 3.1 trillion miles from federal highway, and then that's the denominator, and they take 6.1 million reported crashes. It's crashes over miles. But that's actually incorrect. And the reason it's incorrect is because you have two vehicles, and there's on average 1.8 vehicles involved in each crash. So you need to correct that. You need to times it by 1.8 vehicles, you get 10.9 million, and then you do the division. So what the difference here, and why I'm pointing it out, is because it really matters. It's 75% difference between a 2 crashes per mile incorrect calculation and a 3.5 crashes per mile, which is correct. That's 75% difference. And of course, if you're predetermined pessimistic, you will let this fly under the radar, and you would want to use the lower number. But I would say a properly reviewed scientific paper, they will catch this. But I don't think your average person, and there's a lot of people doing this, journalists and others, that are claiming things on crashes, and this is a really important part of that. And if you don't believe me, please look at this IHS study and study up about it. The last one I'm going to talk about is ODD-specific matching. So operational design domain, the benchmark you're using, it must be calibrated for where you're driving. And that's because not all streets are equally challenging. I think this is something that's intuitive to you. If you're driving in downtown San Francisco, it's more challenging than when you're driving on a rural street, a suburban area. And this comes out in the numbers. There's an example what I have with the blue. We published a paper on this in 2020. And this is one of the controls that are typically done, is you need to, at least when you select a crash database, does it have heavy vehicles to heavy vehicle crashes in it? Oh, if it does, then you should take those out, because we're not a heavy vehicle. That's like at that level. Or that if you're driving at night only, then you should be comparing to the right conditions of your ODD, or what streets you're working on, et cetera. And there's a limit to that, of course, where there's a filtering that is needed, but you can't get as detailed as you'd like. It'd be great if we could get what is the risk of a skateboarder running downhill on this specific hill in San Francisco. That'd be fabulous if we had that level of detail. But there are limits to your data sets. But at least you should declare your limitations in these data sets. I think this is kind of intuitive to many people, but is often overlooked. So I wanted to conclude that we've taken a stance here. We've shown that we have incredible safety performance, and I think this is part of what we're calling a safety paradox of new technology. The paradox is that when you introduce new technology, which is later seen as obviously improving safety, and let's take some examples. Let's take the seat belt. And please remember what happened, if you're old enough, in the 70s, when there's a rigorous debate about the seatbelt. My uncles were all saying, I'll be trapped if I'm wearing this seatbelt, etc. Where is that now? This is the #1 safety technology that saved more lives than any other technology. Again, you see that with ESC, stability control systems. There's a rigorous debate about that. You see it with auto braking. This is now mandatory with the GSR. There's laws on these technologies. And during the development of those, there was a phase where people were very negative towards these technologies. And this is the paradox. Some people see safe technology as unsafe. And I think that part of that has to do with emotions, or safety as an emotion. So, and we need to work with that and develop the trust with that. But I do think that technology that is oriented deductively, deductive reasoning says that an interior sensor, occupant sensor that prevents a child from being locked in, that's what you'd be using as your argument to save lives. Deductive reasoning. You wouldn't put a requirement that says you need 1 billion miles before I believe you. But somehow that argument is being made against autonomous vehicles. And I'll get to this discussion about fatalities. So my main point today is that we must control the factors that achieve a valid apples-to-apples comparison. And if we're following the scientific method, then that will be corrected, because it's the evidence you're following, if the evidence is presented in the correct manner. But okay, so we should keep an eye on the ball. So remember that curve with the exponential with the gray off to the left? Is that where we should have our focus? With the most frequent occurring things, scratches and dents, any contact event, those are most frequent. I think most of us will agree it's the events with high energy potential, kinematic energy, that affect our bodies, which is what's defining safety, is our tolerance in our bodies. This is what we need to be paying attention to. We need to be able to see which events matter. We need to work with it in a different way, because Vision Zero, the Safe Systems approach, the National Road Safety Strategy, it's all directed at learnings from how to work with fatalities and seriously injured. And it's not the same as working with more frequently occurring things, because they are so rare. So you need to work in a different way with deductive reasoning and other. Typically what you do is you look at the causation, the crash causation. You're developing a fatigue detection system, because fatigue it's fatal. That's the reason. It's a connection between the causation and the technology that you're developing for. And that's part of the evidence. Speed is a well-known relationship. Many of the treatments, road treatments that are developed, are not based off of statistical evidence. They're based off of a relationship, a direct relationship between speed and fatalities. So this is how we need to be able to be mature enough to discuss these things. And I think this is my last point. So in closing, I think that Waymo, we're doing our part by continuing to expand. Because if we continue to expand the public access, we have access to not just the safety benefits, but to the other benefits, like the accessibility being able to move around independently, to serve underserved communities. Did you know that we have electric fleets that are utilized 4 times more than a privately owned vehicle? 4 times more. So there's 4 times more zero-emission miles by using a Waymo. And it's 100% renewable energy. I think there's a lot of really, really great reasons to choose a Waymo. And go to San Francisco or Phoenix or Los Angeles, download the app, and have yourself a first ride.